Well, I'm back. Welcome to another episode of Mr. Rodder's Neighborhood. Today, with everything kind of being on the back burner for essentially the entire windage project, windage tray project for the 364 small block, we're kind of back to just doing a few things that haven't been done before, so I thought I would kind of run through them. As you can see here, I got two oil pans, one for a 300, one for a 350 Buick. I'm just going to talk interchangeability between the small block Buick, which is actually quite a bit of stuff. They are all based on the same family of engine. So without further ado, we'll get into a few things here. Now, the only one I'm missing for an oil pan, for an example, is a 215 oil pan. The 215, very similar to the 300 with the deep rear kick-in, but it's actually even deeper, and then the pan itself is moved forward quite a bit. So there's probably at least another quart of oil in that one when compared to the 300. Now, in the family of the small block Buick, the 215 is the only one that's out of all the V8s that the oil pan is essentially not interchangeable. It does have its own bolt pattern here. It has its own proprietary gasket. It does have its own shape because it came in 61 to 63 Buick Specials only. Now, in this case here for the Buick 350 oil pan, which a 340 I'm assuming is like the 350. I've never had a 340, so I don't necessarily know. But either way, it doesn't. I really don't see it making much of a difference which pan it has. It's going to be either one of these. It does share a lot of things in common with the 350 Buick, but then there is quite a few similarities between the 300. So it is the go-between between the two, but in reality, either pan is interchangeable on the 300, 340, and 350 Buick. The big things that I've noticed over the period of time is the 300 Buick has its own, essentially its own water pump. I haven't found another one, and a 340 may be the same. Like I said, I've never had a 340. But the 215 has its own water pump, and the difference between the 215 and the rest of them is easily identifiable, because if you look at the water pump here on the later engines, this is where your alternator bracket connects to hold your alternator, and the 215 does not have it. The alternator is actually mounted down low. If you have a 62 before, it's a generator and it's mounted down low on the engine. Matter of fact, there's not even any drilled openings on the head to hold a bracket off the head. So everything is mounted down low. But because the 300 has its own water pump, it does have it's pretty much its own pulley system, okay, that I've noticed. And I would have to say it probably has a very similar water pump to the 340, just because I have seen a 340 lower pulley, and the lower pulley for the 300 is exactly the same as the 340. It looks visually the same. There may be some measurement difference, but the easily identifiable part is it's got this separator ring in here that I'm assuming is for support. Now, the early 215s have this as well, but it's a different offset on all the pulleys than the 300. So those things are a major difference when you're talking interchangeability, because if you pull one out and drop another one in, things may or may not line up depending on what you have. Now, the oil pan for the 300, the reason why it is the way that it is if you remember, the 300 Buick was the first oil pan for the small block Buick that put it in the B-body car with the X-frame. The X-frame B-body cars in 64 were all rear steer. 64 and 65 essentially are completely different frame types. The 65 is when it went to the perimeter style frame, but it retained the same oil pan for the 300 throughout its entire run. So the 300 oil pan itself is this is what you need if you need to mount. If you would, like, say you were taking a 300 Buick out of a 64 and it was just ragged out and tired and you wanted to replace it with a 350 Buick, it's virtually a no-brainer. You'd need to remove the 350 oil pan and the pickup, and then put the 300 oil pan on the pickup on and bolt the motor back in. Now, the 64 is kind of weird because it does have its own different style motor mounts, different style frame mounts, but all in all, the 350 will fit in place of the 300, no problem, no questions asked. And in my opinion, is probably the better thing to do if it's a cruiser, because the 350 ran so many more years, has hardened valve seats, it will run good on regular gas, and make considerably more torque than the 300. Okay, so back to the differences though. The 350 Buick in 1968, 69, and 70 had a short water pump that actually used the same similar pulleys as the 455, the 400, 430, 455 family. When they went in 1971, they realized that what they needed to do, instead of having multiple different sets of pulleys and brackets and everything, that they extended the length of the water pump on the 350 Buick to match and work with the pulleys from the 455. So 71 and later, the brackets and pulleys are completely interchangeable amongst the small block and the big blocks. Now, if you were to take the pulley assembly off of the small block and the bracket assembly off of the small block, say like, or even a big block, you could put them on even a 300. It would probably fit just fine. The belts would have to be changed because the deck height is considerably different, but other than that though, it should bolt on fairly easy and work just fine. As long as you use the corresponding water pump for it and you have the correct brackets. Now, the big problem with the 300 is if you remember, I showed you this lower pulley with the separator plate here. Now, these holes, the smaller holes, are for the bolts that go into the harmonic balancer. The larger bolts are because the 300 uses an aluminum harmonic balancer, and the aluminum can't be welded to the cast iron center section of the harmonic balancer, so it's swedged into place, right? Where it's swedged is these holes here, these large holes. From the factory, this is exactly how it looks, and it has these large swedged areas that actually fit around the pulley. The pulley has to sit over those swedged areas, and you cannot do that on a 350 style harmonic damper. So here's the 350, right? Two very similar. You could actually interchange them, but if you see, there is no swedge markings on the 350 harmonic balancer, so the pulley itself would be very hard to interchange with using this harmonic balancer. You would likely have to change it over to this one, or you could use this pulley, the 300 style pulley, on the 350 balancer. Because it doesn't have the swedged openings, you're just still going to have the open spots in the pulley and it'll still bolt on. So those are your big major factors. What's honestly probably the weirdest thing that I found is that, the harmonic balancer is virtually the same amongst the 350 and the V6, so they are interchangeable as well. I don't know what years are interchangeable, because I'm sure at some point it does change. But the balance appears to be the same on all of them. All right, so distributors. Okay, here's the unique thing about Buick Distributors. This is a 300 distributor, but when the engineers sat down and they tried to make everything as simple as possible, these distributors are virtually the same across the entire Buick V8 family. So you could have a 215 distributor and put it in a 350. You could fit it in a 215, 300, 340, and 350 Buick. Matter of fact, even the V6 distributors will drop right into the V8s. It just has, you'd have to change the center shaft to have the 8 contact points instead of 6. And the neat thing about these is that you can technically just take this gear off, and then you drive the pin out, put a new gear on for a big block, and it'll drop right in a big block. It's the same distributor housing. So if you're doing HEI on a big block and it's hard to find one for a 455, or you're looking for, you know, historic pieces from 74 or 5, whatever, you can literally just take a small block one and knock the gear off and put the small block distributor in the 455. Okay, other than that, let's see here. So we went over some of the pulleys, the oil pans. They are essentially, you have to use the pickup that's meant for the pan. If you get the pan off at 300, you use the pickup for the 300. If you get it off of a 350, you need to use the pickup for a 350. The other neat thing is that the later model V6s, you can use the 5/8 pickup tube on the 350 with the 350 pan. It seems to work just fine. I've never tried one on a 300. I don't see why it wouldn't work, but there is a difference here at the location of the sump. So if you look and see where the sump is at, you can see that it's significantly forward on the 300, which might be a good thing because it buys you a little bit of room to put the V6 style pickup in there, but I have never tried one. So that's entirely up to you. Let's see. Other than that, the motor mounts are completely interchangeable between the V6, the 215, the 300, the 340, and the 350. The one thing I have noticed is that the 215 motor mounts on the 350, you'll need to shim the passenger side of the block, because there is a spot on the block that's machined in the later 350s that's not on the 300 and it's not on the 215. I'm not entirely sure about the 340, but otherwise, and it would work fine if you were to go from, like, say, so a 350 Buick in a 81, well, actually 78 to 87 Regal just requires using the V6 motor mounts, and it'll drop right into the V6 spot. The 215 technically would be able to use the V6 motor mounts and drop in the same spot as well. I don't know what you would do about a transmission. I imagine maybe a D&D bell housing and a T5, but the 215 will accept the V6 style Buick motor mounts. Let's see. I think that actually kind of covers a majority of stuff. Yeah, so if you're wanting to, like, say you're doing rat rod, Buick 350 and something, and you don't have, you're using a Carter AFB carburetor with a spacer or adapter, the 300 fuel pump is probably what you would need for your 350 Buick. It looks very similar to the one on the 350 Buick, except for the lines themselves are just open fitting that you can put a pipe thread fitting in and run a hose up to the carburetor if you're using, like, say, an AFB. If you had a quadrajet, you know, you don't have to deal with this. You can use the steel line. There's actually companies like Inline Tube that make a pre-bent line for a 350 Buick. But 300, 340, I don't know. I'm pretty certain you should be able to use the 350 pump in the 300, 340. I don't see why it would be a problem. The only issue is, you know, you're going to have to stick with this type of line or make your own line. There isn't one that's pre-bent for the 300 to accept a quadrajet. So, and I can see where it'd be easy to do a quadrajet on a 300, because if you had a 64 intake manifold that was aluminum, you just weld the pad out some and then cut it all out. Use a gasket from it's actually the same flange. So you should be able to put the quadrajet gasket out or down on the intake manifold, draw it out, and then cut it out. So, all right, well, I think that's gonna kind of conclude today's video. I didn't have a lot of stuff to discuss because I was hoping to work on this pan, but I haven't been able to find any cutoff wheels yet. So hopefully this is enlightening for y'all. So I'll see you tomorrow.